Very warm welcome here from Victoria to our virtual audience in Canada and around the world. My name is Oliver Schmidtke, and I have the privilege of directing the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. And I'm delighted, and we at the Center are delighted to host today's webinar on contested national memory in Canada and the role of the right. Before we start off, let me acknowledge and with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional unceded territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees and Esquimalt and the Saanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. It is in the spirit of this land acknowledgement that today's event is also meant to address the legacy of colonialism and how it is a foundational part of who we are as Canadians and how we define contemporary Canadian identity. Today's event is part of a webinar series, 6 webinars altogether, entitled European and North American Perspectives on Commemorating and Addressing Past Injustices. And we've started mostly with a focus on Europe, and I'm really thrilled that we can now turn our attention to the Canadian context. And these 6 webinars are meant to lead us gradually to a symposium that we hope to organize in October at the University of Victoria. So I hope that with the pandemic that will be possible. And I also hope to see some of you at the event. And let me take this opportunity to thank the German Konrad Adenauer Foundation and its office in Ottawa and the European Union for providing us with funding for this exciting initiative that we have in this respect. Now, today's event, we will be able to focus over debates on contemporary identity and on memory in Canada and how it impacts contemporary realities, social and political realities. And Canada seems to be a country that has somewhat avoided and been sheltered from the attempts of the populist right to use historic narratives for their political purpose. Mostly this is a form of exclusionary form of nationalism, if not nativist ideologies. But yet at the same time, these battles over nationalist narratives and public memory have clearly captured the imagination of the Canadian public recently as well, not least with respect to the legacy of colonial rule in this country and what had happened was discovered at the Kamloops residential school. These debates speak importantly and often in highly controversial terms to how we envision our political community, whose story is being told, whose past injustices is being recognized and remembered, and as a consequence, who legitimately belongs to our political community. And our panel today will focus on these issues as they're being raised also by right-wing memory activism and the way that these contentious debates over historic narratives play out in the contemporary Canadian context. And to be honest, I can't think of a better person to lead us through this than my colleague, Dr. Matt James from the Political Science Department here at the University of Victoria. So he generously accepted my invitation to moderate today's session. Matt James is, as I said, a professor here at U of Vic, and his research looks and focuses on issues of reparation, political apologies, transitional justice, social memory, social movements, and this in the context of Canadian politics, issues of citizenship and constitutionalism. So with this, a very warm welcome to you, the audience, to our panelists, and a special thank you to Matt, who will take it away now. Matt, the virtual floor is all yours now.
Well, thanks very much, Oliver. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the opportunity. And I want to also thank the work Beata Schmidtke, Jody Walsh, Fazla Matt, and others making this possible. And thanks, Oliver, for the land acknowledgement, which is, I think, in this particular context, just a really important kind of cue that we're grappling with the implications of land dispossession, attempted sovereignty dispossession, and Indigenous resilience and Indigenous resurgence in the context of this discussion, national memory or memories in Canada, contestation around memory, the so-called history wars and their apparent arrival here in Canada now, and the kind of cue that I gave in the form of the abstract for today's event suggested a focus especially on the role of the right. And we'll see, people can kind of take that up or not as they see fit. I'm just going to introduce the panelists, and I'll say a few words about how we're going to proceed, and then we'll turn it over to them and get things going here. So we're going to go in alphabetical first name order. And so Adele Perry is the director of the Center for Human Rights and distinguished professor at the University of Manitoba. She's a historian of colonialism and imperialism, transnationalism, gender, sexuality, racism, and Western Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. So thanks and welcome to Adele. Omiyasu Wapasu is a Nehio Iskwayo, Cree woman living in the unceded Lenni territory of Abegwit, also known as Prince Edward Island. And she's currently in the faculties of arts and education at the University of Prince Edward Island. But as of August 1st, she's moving to Carleton University's School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies and the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism there. Congratulations to Carleton University. And she's going to there continue her lecturing and research on Indigenous worldviews in regards to space, place, and her passion in historical Indigenous activism, art, and gender. And just want to also note that Omiyasu co-wrote the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nation Women's Commission submission to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and to LGBTQIA+ people. Welcome and thanks, Omiyasu. And Ryan Moran, it's his kind of new UVic colleague, I'm delighted to point out, is the inaugural Associate University Librarian Reconciliation at the University of Victoria. And Ryan is a member of the Red River Métis Nation and is the founding director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And that's, among other things, where the archives of the TRC are kept and managed. And Sean Carleton is an assistant professor in the departments of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba. And he's a historian and Indigenous studies scholar. And as a settler scholar, his research is focusing particularly on the history of colonialism, capitalism, and education in Canada. I've already been introduced. So I'm pleased to be here. The abstract for the event kind of said that we're looking at controversies over the public honoring of historical figures like John A. Macdonald, Egerton Ryerson, Edward Cornwallis. And these controversies seem to have made much more palpable in Canada than maybe many people would have noticed or felt until recently. Some of the kind of debates and with the kind of certain intensity and involvement of overtly right-wing and indeed racist voices that is quite familiar in many European contexts. And so I was kind of interested in throwing together the abstract, how kind of mainstream conservatives who talk about honoring the legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald and defending figures like Egerton Ryerson, how do they navigate the historical proximity of these figures to genocide and white supremacy, and how do they navigate their proximity to far-right actors who've been fundraising, propagandizing, issuing petitions, and all sorts of other things in these new battles over national narratives, groups like the Proud Boys, Soldiers of Odin, and so on. So what do we learn basically about Canadian memory and debates over Canadian memories in this new kind of context? If I might be so bold, when it comes time to the Q&A, maybe other people might disagree with me, but I'm kind of hoping that in the Q&A, we don't rehearse some of the really well-tilled ground of should Canada remove these statues, or is removing statues tantamount to erasing history. I suspect that for many of the panelists, they're more than familiar with the various sorts of things that get said in the comment section of newspapers on these topics, and I'm kind of hoping we can push things a little bit further there. But maybe people disagree, and that's fair. So the method of proceeding here is as follows. We're going to have an initial round of reflections, just about 5 minutes each from each of the panelists. I'll be trying to keep time. And the opening round is just going to be on the following kind of question or prompt. What are the key fault lines and key dangers and possibilities in Canada's recent conflicts and debates over honoring figures such as Ryerson, Cornwallis, and Macdonald? And I'm going to be kind of listening intently to the introductory round, and I'm going to try to distill out of that a second question or point around which to focus an additional second round of 5-minute reflections from each of the participants. And I'm going to try to make sure this doesn't take us beyond the 1 hour mark, at which point we'll open the floor and I'll be moderating the Q&A with the panelists and the audience members. So for folks out there, and I'm just delighted to see so many of you there, and I scrolled through the names and recognizing some familiar ones, and really grateful for that. Please put your questions using the submit question feature. That's at the very bottom of your screen, the far right, there's a little Q&A box. You can put your questions there and they'll be visible to myself and the panelists, but not the audience. So when it comes time, I'll be reading those questions aloud for everybody to hear, and that's how we're going to kind of proceed, and we'll be wrapping up at 12 o'clock noon sharp. So with no further ado, thanks for your patience. Let's kick it off with Adele Perry.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Matt, and for the opportunity to be a part of this really, I think, timely and auspicious panel. I'm coming to you from my porch, not very far away from the meetings of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and also of the Manitoba Act. And I am always honored to be here as a guest, a settler, and a treaty partner. To take up Matt's question, I think that the fault lines are both deeper and more complicated than they can sort of at first seem. I see a lot of the resistance that we are currently seeing on display to calls to revive commemorative practices in Canada as rooted in a core and kind of constitutive devaluation of both Indigenous history and humanity. I think we can see that in a number of ways, including how the robust and nuanced humanity of white men is centered and tended to, while at the same time, the capacity of Indigenous people to have complex human experiences, including of tragedy and genocide, but also of brilliance and beauty and love, is at best doubted. It follows, I think, from that starting point that those who implicitly or explicitly deny this Indigenous humanity are also unwilling to center those histories in how we see Canada, its histories. Thus, we see the continual framing of histories of dispossession and loss as unfortunate moments, often dark chapters, in a history of the Canadian nation that remains largely, if not entirely, unchanged. This is the line that is very much shot through the open letter coordinated by the Macdonald Laurier Institute in January of this year. And it's also very much reiterated in David Frum's predictable piece in the most recent version of the Atlantic magazine. And the publication of the latter on Indigenous Peoples Day, no less, suggests that the extent to which confirmation of longstanding Tecumlip's knowledge of unmarked graves outside of the Kamloops Indian Residential School has reframed public discourse on these questions remains partial and fragile. The framing of today's panel, I think, links these kinds of arguments and this sort of resistance to reconsidering history and commemoration to the work of the political right in Canada. And I think that's a really important point and absolutely helps us register the connections that were so clear during the Harper years and remain really critical in all sorts of ways, and help us understand the work of people like C.P. Champion, advisor to Alberta's recent curriculum reform, strangely self-appointed opponent of all efforts to recognize the violence and loss of histories of residential schooling, and relentlessly cruel Twitter troll. But I think we also need to remember the ways that racism and nationalism work to build capacious tents. This is one of the oldest points of anti-racist and critical scholarship. The way that causes of nation and race can work to draw together people, communities, and arguments that we would not expect to find common cause. And on the list of signatories to the Macdonald Laurier open letter in defense of Sir John A. Macdonald's reputation, we see people who I don't think can be meaningfully called right-wing. We can also see this point played out at greater length in Robin Fisher's recent essay in the Ormsby Review. And south of the border, we can see it in historians, almost exclusively white and male response to the 1619 project. And I'm thinking in particular here of Sean Walentz's pedantic critique of lead author Nicole Hannah-Jones's work. In that, I don't see a meaningful right-wing response as much as I see a very incoherent one from someone who cannot quibble with the substantive argument made by Hannah-Jones and her colleagues, but is flustered by the fact that he and those like him are no longer driving the narrative. Whiteness is a hell of a thing, and it can make for odd bedfellows. In the American context, a historian named L.D. Burnett, and she said this on Twitter, and I can't find the tweet, but I'll keep looking for it. But a month ago, she commented that what she called liberal historians provided the talking points for what has become an organized right-wing backlash to the 1619 project and to anti-racist pedagogies more generally. And I think there's been similar kind of connections in Canada, where a lot of kind of the commemorative practices that are now under critical discussion don't have their origins so much in the right as they do in kind of a particular sort of post-war English Canadian nationalism that had a political kind of connections in a number of different directions. These acts of naming are now being reconsidered in light of histories of Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples. And this process of contestation has brought unprecedented attention to history itself. These are histories that are, of course, far from unknown by the communities that lived through them, and they are often far from unknown by professional historians. But that they can continue to startle and surprise is a reminder, I think, of the importance of the conversations like the one we're having today. So that's what I would like to begin with, and I am really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and from the folks who've joined us on this June Day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adele. We'll turn it over now to Omiyasu Wapasu. Omiyasu, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Adele, for that really thoughtful start to this discussion. And thank you to Matt and Oliver for inviting me. And as I mentioned, I feel really out of depth with these excellent scholars. So I just wanted to start with the title of this panel, because it was really throwing me for a loop for a long time. And so that is because the concepts of left and right always seemed very boring to me. And it was frustrating to me that as a voter, as a human being, my politics only gave me those two options. And so since I had been introduced to the two concepts and had an opportunity to start thinking more deeply about them, besides the sort of liberal indoctrination I received in elementary and high school, the discussion came about that I was reading in my undergrad was different analyses of globalization. And these offered a couple of different options that I had a chance to look at. And one of them was the idea that globalization is increasing worldwide totalitarianism. And that has stuck in my mind for a long time and caused me a lot of worry. And the other was some work by Indigenous scholars on treaty federalism and the opportunities for governance that Indigenous peoples offered, which I always found much more interesting and representative of democracy. So when I think of right and left, I just find it very, I guess, dichotomizing and hard for me to grasp, because I don't think that it offers the best options, really, is my answer to that question. And I will get to the fault lines in a bit. I just wanted to rant a little bit about that. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight, and something that I've learned a lot about this year, unfortunately, just being older and having 3 years in the academy as a professional as opposed to being a student, was I finally understand the concept of white supremacy. And now that I understand it, I can't un-understand it. And I think in the nicest way possible, that is what Adele may have been hinting at in regards to the capacious tent that whiteness creates for liberals and right-wing advocates and intellectuals. So when I think of people who are thinking in a way that is right-wing, the only thing that I can think of is that as human beings, I think we are fundamentally selfish, lazy, and self-centered. And the only reason I can say that is because I feel selfish, lazy, and self-centered most of the time. And so there are two ways to deal with that fundamental human trait. And I'm saying it's fundamental because I'm like that, so I hope other people are. There are two ways to deal with that. And one way is to refuse to be our selfish, lazy, self-centered people and figure out how to be generous, hardworking, kind, thoughtful people. Or we can continue to be selfish, lazy, and self-centered, and then build a whole structure of rationalization around that. And so my theory that I'm just putting out there is that that might be what being right-wing is like. Couldn't say for sure, but that's my interpretation. So the other point that I just wanted to make about the concepts that I think lie outside of being right or left-wing is this other concept of democracy and governance that I'm really interested in historically. I think I'm speaking to a number of historians. So the reason I began my dissertation or my doctoral work in the first place was because, or one of them anyway, was because I was convinced that the change of mobility of human beings to, the civic and the city life and the non-nomadic, the settled life really has a major impact on governance and deeply damages and damaged Indigenous democracy. And it fundamentally changes how society works. So I think that Indigenous peoples pre-settlement had some pretty fantastic democracies, but they were partially made possible by our personal mobility. So even now, I had a discussion with a friend about personal sovereignty, and that's one of the issues that the federal government has in negotiating with us, is because not only do we see ourselves as nations, as communities, but we also see ourselves as individuals with sovereign rights. So that was just one thing I want to throw in there. Also, is just different ideas of governance and democracy that stand outside of concepts of left and right. And so eventually one day, maybe I would like to see or do a further examination of the link between democracy and mobility and how that changes everything. And maybe, since all of you are much more learned than I am, you already have had that thought and study. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the capacious tense, and I had a few little slides to just demonstrate the personal impact that this has on me through the many wonderful people who have asked me to address the topic of the statues across Canada that are being addressed. And so I think that these few slides will demonstrate what is at stake and how capacious these tense are. So I just have to find my PowerPoint. Okay. Here it is. Okay. So are you seeing? You're seeing everything. So I just want to go from start slide. Okay. So this is just a little bit of the kind of mail that I received after these discussions. And I ordered them. I don't get a lot of hate mail, and luckily I don't read the comments, but I did order them to demonstrate the capacious tense that Adele was speaking of. So we have some liberal people with some various ideas, but it quickly devolves, and you will see how that happens in these few emails. So first, hi, I just read some of your comments regarding statues of founding Canadians. I understand that you were concerned about some aspects of the creation and established of Canada, our country. However, I am willing to bet some of my former profs, such as, but not only John Saywell, Ramsey Cook, Fernand Ouellette, or their very good friend Pierre Elliott Trudeau would ever agree with what you say about strong dynamic of inequality or your context when you say our country. The sentiment you express when you say our country is inconsistent with your reference to the foundation of our country. Like a human character, the character of Canada is not perfect. Nonetheless, they created it, and hundreds of thousands died on their behalf. To the soldiers who died in World War I, John A. was a hero. Suppose you stand up and say on November 11th at 11 a.m. that those heroes' beliefs that they held of their country were wrong. So I think this is a pretty common kind of email that I've received. It's specifically attached to veterans and what veterans fight for. But I mean, even just quickly, first of all, the whole list of people that they're referring at the beginning is white men. And so that isn't demonstrating anything about equality. It's also saying that as an Indigenous person, I don't belong to this country and this country is not mine. And finally, obviously, many Indigenous peoples died for the creation of this country. And those aren't the lives that mattered, just following up on what Adele said previously about who deserves humanity. Okay. And the next we have, if we want to continue to develop as a democracy, we have to remember that nuances are incredibly important. Powerful and meaningful words. As a scholar with an expertise in Indigenous issues, I wonder how you view the nuances of Indigenous leader Joseph Brant, a man whose reputation includes being one of Canada's biggest slave owner and slave trader. It is well documented that Brant had a particularly penchant for young Black girls. I ask because in my area, Brant is a celebrated man with a city, hospital country, and numerous other memorials in his name. My daughter was born in Joseph Brant Hospital in Burlington. So how do you reconcile with the deeds of John A. Macdonald versus the deeds of Joseph Brant and still maintain credibility? So for this email, I just responded that he had made a moot point, and we do not live in a Mohawk country that is run by Joseph Brant's ancestors and all the people that look like him. So, you know, I thought it was interesting points that he brought up, but I also thought that it was completely irrelevant in his discussion. And I wondered why this had anything to do with my credibility personally, because I never addressed any of these issues. So again, I'm not allowed to have a voice because I am not speaking for a man, I guess. Okay, and so this is in the vein of the capacious tense. So we have one person, we have another person, and they're denying my humanity in some somewhat subtle ways. And then we have this person. I read your comments on CBC News regarding Colton Boushie. I think you were way off base. Colton Boushie most likely would be alive today if he would have had a better mom and home life. And I'm sorry, I should have given a trigger warning. This is really hard for me even to read. He was out terrorizing people that day and his choices had consequences. If he would have been taught that working for a living is important and to be responsible in life, he would have been different. Instead, he was a gangbanger thug. His mom is in the business of blaming others for her mistakes and her deplorable behavior as a mom. She ought to be ashamed, but she doesn't feel shame. The Indians have perpetuated lying and stealing for generations. Time to end the money train, and they can fend for themselves just like everyone else has to. And so that's the tent. Here are some pegs, and the others have perhaps, you know, the nylon surrounding it. So just a couple more points I wanted to make before we go on to, I think Rye is next. I just wanted to bring up one final thing in regards to who deserves humanity, and in history in particular, and a historiographical trend that I've noted when I was just doing a presentation, not exactly for fun, but on the job market, on the world wars, was that Black Canadians still continue to be deserving of humanity in our historiography. And we can really see that in the portrayal of, or the lack thereof, of portrayal or existence even of Black Canadians and their history, including a slaveholding history in Canada. And I think that's, it's just really sad. It's really disappointing. And at the same time, because of the success and what my friend terms the coolness of the Black Lives Movement, sometimes new Canadians, often Black Canadians, can be used to undermine the Indigenous message and to create us into a completely racialized group of people, when really, although I like to be involved in BIPOC issues, and my BIPOC friends do as well, we understand that we have deep differences. The one thing that we share in common is a negative experience of white supremacy. So with that, I think I will close the door on my little chapter, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Omiyasu. And Omiyasu was correct. Rye Moran is indeed the next speaker. Take it away, Rye.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thanks to the organizers and my fellow panelists for including me in this very, very important conversation. And thank you all to being willing to listen to me for a little bit here. You know, I think when I reflect back on my own personal journey through this conversation of memory contestation here in this country, I suppose what I reflect upon is that memory has always been deeply contested since really the dawn of colonization here, or the efforts of colonization here in Canada. And I think it's important that we recognize that there has been long-standing, intentional, and deeply embedded resistance by Indigenous peoples to the displacement of many memories and many important histories and languages, of course, that are so vital and so essential to understanding what this land actually is. We see that throughout our recent history, when we look at major initiatives such as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Stonechild, Ipperwash, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, we see that ongoing resistance and efforts made by Indigenous peoples to challenge this country to recognize the inherent and fundamental conflict that sits right at the heart of the very fabric or the very essence of what this country is. And I think, as others have already expressed, it is remarkable how violently and how vicious this country can be when even simple questions are asked of who we ought to remember and point out to the inherent legitimacies of Indigenous histories. I think so much of what happens when we ask questions or we demand greater insight into our major historical figures like Sir John A. Macdonald is just the knee-jerk, violent maintenance of the myth of these individuals and the clinging on to a myth of singular, unified Canada, which really has never existed and has yet deliberately and very intentionally been manufactured throughout our public education system and our systems of memory and dissemination of memory. I mean, to me, this really comes home right today, actually, because even as I opened up the news this morning, I see the current Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, really taking great offense to the fact that some communities across the country are choosing not to celebrate Canada Day this day. And he's saying, or the quote on CBC is saying that, it's time to give thanks for living in the greatest country in the world. I mean, it's really hard to say those words as an Indigenous person in this country. And I think what the challenge for many Canadians is here is that we haven't yet, that the country hasn't yet really grasped the enormity of findings of genocide and findings of cultural genocide. And it's really tough. I would say it's impossible to square genocide with the greatest country in the world. This is a deeply flawed and highly problematic nation that we live in. And while there have been some positive attributes, this history, when viewed from the perspective of residential school survivors or Indigenous peoples, obviously is very fundamentally different. I think the insidiousness of the violence, of the maintenance of the myth, of the attacks on the questions and the very legitimate human rights-based questions that are being asked, also, as others have already said, are fundamentally reinforced and buttressed just by the systemic nature of the fact that racism, white supremacy, prejudice, violence is accepted as being commonplace, and it's diffused throughout all of our systems and all of our institutions. So even when the major the major sort of Trump generated activities that were happening in the United States, I mean, you could see people from many sectors, many walks of life in Canada being outwardly supportive of those types of concepts and ideas. And that just gives further indication of how deeply entrenched and widely diffused these ideas are. And again, there's no great discovery here. There's no great reveal here, because we only have to look to very recent reports, such as the report issued by Mary-Ellen Turcotte-Lafond on systemic racism in the healthcare system, to see that there is this continued violence and continued maintenance of particular highly prejudiced and very discriminatory ideals and beliefs that come from this concept of a monoistic Canada that erode the inherent rights of human rights and dignity. And that's where I guess my personal hope is, and my recognition is that we are still so early as a country in terms of broadly discussing and dialoguing about human rights. And it's only just really within the past 2 weeks that Canada has agreed to harmonize its laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which naturally not only affirms the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, but requires us, if we're going to be serious about human rights, to further engage in these conversations of memory and place names and the displacement of place names that have all represented fundamental and highly targeted violations of inherent human rights. So we're just still starting, I think, as a country, and we're just starting, I think, to really walk further down a much more comprehensive idea that the memory, the inherent memory of Canada can and must be challenged, can and must be critiqued. We have to put really everything on the table, I think, at the moment, in order to begin to effectively sort of undo or deconstruct these systems of privilege, power, and authority that have been, of course, intentionally constructed. So, in short, I would say that I personally, and I'm sure this is shared by everybody in the call, I mean, these are important conversations to be having, and I think the questions that are being asked are the fundamental part of it. What dismays me is the amount of violence that is maintained and is used in trying to suppress or quell these questions. And the emails that have already been circulated, I think there's not a single one of us that hasn't received emails like that. And they are difficult and they are problematic to have to deal with. And I think that's where, again, I have great wishes that we didn't have to do that, and that we would all begin to be able to have a much more fulsome understanding of what the value is in embracing just the inherent nature of improving and deepening our collective understanding of who we are, where we come from, and why we're all here. So I'm going to leave it there. I really look forward to hearing the rest of my panelists here as we move forward through the discussion.
Thank you, Rye. And Sean Carlton, take it away, Sean.
Okay, is my PowerPoint there showing, Matt?
Yes, it is, Sean.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks to Adele, Misu, and Rye for their thoughts, and to Matt and Oliver and others for organizing this event and for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. Since I'm going last in the first round, and my colleagues have raised a number of excellent points about the key fault lines and dangers and possibilities in sort of recent history wars, I'm going to do something a bit different and put some theory on the board and root it in these two very different but still quite similar pictures from just last summer. So the first image on the left is Conservative leader at the time, Andrew Scheer, stumping in front of the John A. Macdonald statue in Regina, Treaty 4 territory on September 3rd, defending the statue in honor of Macdonald after the toppling of the Macdonald statue in Montreal. The second on the right perhaps fittingly. 2 months earlier to the day is Donald J. Trump holding a rally around the 4th of July at the height of a global pandemic and the racial reckoning unfolding in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd in front of Mount Rushmore, illuminated at the top, decrying statue toppling and, quote, the merciless campaign to wipe out our history, right, in front of the sacred Black Hills, stolen from the Lakota people against treaty agreements to carve the faces of colonizer presidents onto, right? This is quite the photograph. Now, on the surface, it's pretty easy to see what both of these politicians are doing, right? They're playing on colonial symbolism and engaging in the history wars, or to use Rye's phrase, right? They're maintaining colonial mythology to score some cheap political points. But what I want to suggest quickly, kind of building on what Rye was just saying, is that that is not all that is going on here. There is a danger in seeing this as something new. And what I'm going to argue is that this kind of performative posturing is endemic in colonial societies, from the planting of crosses to claim territory to, well, these speeches and spectacles. This is all part of the barbarism of colonial behavior generally, which often manifests in the actions of the right, sure, but is not its sole preserve, as Adele and Amisu were talking about. So to help make this point, I want to draw on the anti-colonial work of theorist A.M. César, Frantz Fanon's teacher. And specifically, I want to engage with a few passages from his 1955 text, Discourse on Colonialism. So at the heart of this text is César's insistence that colonialism and capitalism, by their very twinned nature, is a sickness. That in building a new society and economy through theft, violence, and dispossession, this actually works to decivilize and brutalize colonizers, forcing them consciously and unconsciously towards embracing and even extolling barbarism in politics and in the press and in email comments, etc., as a kind of justification and self-legitimization, right, as a way of safeguarding colonial power and privilege. So César asks, what am I driving at? And he answers, at this idea that no one colonizes innocently, that no one colonizes with impunity either, that a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies colonization and therefore force, is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which is irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another. He says further, colonization, and I repeat, dehumanizes even the most civilized. That colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for, in his words, the native, justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change whoever undertakes it. The colonizers, who in order to ease their conscience gets into the habit of seeing the colonized as an animal, accustoms themselves to treating them like an animal and tends objectively to transform themselves into animals. It is this result, the boomerang effect of colonization, that I wanted to point out, end quote. So Indigenous thinkers from Howard Adams and Emma LaRocque to Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard and Arthur Emanuel have made similar arguments about colonialism being a sickness here in Canada too, and have even drawn on anti-colonial thinkers such as César and Fanon and Memi to advance similar kinds of points. And I think that these insights are important to keep in mind as we have this conversation about why do we see this happening, not just what it looks like. But there is something systemic, something deeper than political points in the present being battled over. So what I want to suggest then, to complement the comments of my colleagues, is that when I see these photos and read the recent letters, op-eds, and tweets by David Frum, Baptiste Drutil, Chris Champion, Aaron O'Toole, etc., what I see is that boomerang of barbarism coming back around. I see sickness. The apologetics on display in recent weeks, as a result, do not surprise me. Barbarism has always been in the bones of colonial societies, such as the US, and yes, Canada too. And here's the opportunity part that I'd like to build on and perhaps talk about later in the comments. But barbarism is not inevitable in César's mind. The rot can be rooted out before it is too late. but it will require a radical rethinking of how, in the case of Canada, that we're talking about today, Canadians understand the past and present, which is really what I think we're seeing taking place in front of our eyes, and what we're here to talk more about today. So I'll end my comments there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sean, and everyone. So the time is just rocketing on, and I'm extremely conscious of the fact that my overlong introduction was certainly one of the key factors in pushing us beyond the kind of mark that we would want to be at this point. I want to have a second round with the panelists. I want to have a Q&A, but we do have to have a hard stop, as they say, at noon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly throw up a couple prompts for a really quick second round from the panelists. And I think this time around, I'm just going to ask the panelists to maybe try to keep yourself to just a 2-minute kind of, throw back quickly, whatever you can. And for people who are thinking about questions, you can start putting your questions in the Q&A now, which might give me a little bit of time to kind of start sorting them through. So basically the 2 prompts that I have are this. One, is dehumanization, and in my own research on this, I've found that the statue defenders cannot even be bothered to pretend to be interested in anything that any Indigenous person has ever said about anything at all, let alone these particular current controversies. It's utterly stunning. So one prompt people could take up if they want is, there an opportunity? What kind of opportunity maybe do you see for Indigenous counter histories and counter memories making any kind of inroads into the capacious tent of Canadian nationalism and white supremacy? And then secondly, another theme that was kind of coming up is the capaciousness of that tent, that yeah, sure, you can identify explicitly right-wing voices who are explicitly ideological about their defense of Sir John A. Macdonald and others. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the country's white supremacist foundations are exposed by these conflicts. And so my second prompt, people could take up if they wanted, would be, what opportunities do you see, if any, for some kind of national identity, some kind of Canadianness coming out of this that isn't white supremacist? And you can take up either one of those, and you got no more than 2 minutes. And so away we go. Adele.
Omiasa, do you want to take that for starters? I saw that you were.
Oh.
Great.
Okay.
Or not.
Thanks.
I could.
I just like to hear what you have to say, Adele.
Okay,
but yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that point about, I mean, it seems like such a basic point to make, to what extent these discussions and the kind of blowback is premised on this kind of debilitating dehumanization and brutality, I think, is, as Omiyasu and Sean both kind of brought out in different ways. I guess one of the ways that I see that playing out is the way that kind of complex histories and historical moments and our ability as sort of thinkers and actors to recognize them is always seems on incredibly short display when we are talking about Indigenous histories. As far as the ability to develop a kind of a national belonging that is somehow other than and more than its white supremacist origins and present, I think these are big questions that theorists of kind of colonialism and of whiteness and power have long kind of discussed. And I think we find them at moments, and we often find them hard to find, largely because, and this is, one of the points of the 1619 projects is that those origins are baked into the formation of the nation. And I think what has become clear is the extent to which that it's very hard to then kind of pull out those aspects that may seem more palatable and somehow sever them from the scaffolding of dispossession and violence, and what that means for how people kind of continue to live and work. But I also want to kind of shout out to the folks that have created other histories and other forms of commemoration. over the long haul, because I think something that Rye brought out is these histories have always been contested. And I think one of the things that is kind of an order of first business that I see is to kind of return to, pay attention to and engage with some of the practices of historical memory and heritage and commemoration and valuing that have centered both Indigenous histories, but also histories of BIPOC communities on these territories, and critical analysis of what it means to be from folks like the people that I'm from non-Indigenous peoples as well. And I think one of the things we can do is to really look for those histories and see them. And certainly where I live in Winnipeg, there's a really long tradition, particularly of sort of situating Métis histories of the nation that are very much at odds with a national vision. And long before Louis Riel was on tea towels, somebody raised the money to make sure that his grave and his family's home were cared for and tended to. And now that is a focus of all sorts of commemoration. And I think we can also start to see those more than maybe we have as well.
Okay, thanks, Adele. That was really sweet of you. Yeah, so I get 2 minutes. Okay, so I guess the other thing, Adele, about the histories is like they're also more interesting. Like how many people actually relate to great white men and have something in common with them? So there's that, right? Just better, more interesting stories. And you hinted at something that I think personally I see as an opportunity for Canada to actually have a national identity, because in terms of racism and my growing understanding of it, I've had so many different theories as to why it exists. And I agree, Sean, that it's definitely a disease and a sickness. And I like the term colonialism because it encapsulates all different kinds of people that can partake in oppression of other people. And I think that's probably the crux of where that inhumanity comes from. And just shout out to the animals, like animals are people too. So if we're treating people like animals, then we just actually don't care about ourselves at all. So the idea of a Canadian identity. So one of my early mentors was Georges Siwi, who has in French and English his Amerindian auto history, and it just as a young person, a young Indigenous person, resonated with me so well, in that it sets out ethics that the Huron-Wendat people in particular utilized in their diplomacy between Algonquian peoples and Iroquoian peoples, and then also the different Indigenous ethics that Algonquian peoples in particular extended to newcomers and settlers. So I think personally that's where I see some identity potential. And one way, a number of ways to create that identity amongst Canadians, I think, would be to have Canadians learn Indigenous languages in public schools so that my son can go to school and learn Cree, because that would be lovely. So I will move on to the next person. Thanks so much.
Thanks, and we ask you, Rye.
Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks to my colleagues on the call here for all your good thoughts. I might just pick up on something that's actually both that Sean said and that's in Sean's background as well, which is depicting the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is a place that I've obviously spent a lot of time in and a lot of hours in. And I think one of the really important ideas is that, this process of colonization dehumanizes us is really important, and we have to recognize, and I think we hopefully do, is that the colonization is inherently violent and inherently not life promoting. There is something fundamental in this overall exercise of capitalism in its relation to colonization in its relationship to capitalism and many other structures that does not enhance or support a diversity of life on this planet. And we see that in our oceans, we see that on our lands, we see that in linguistic diversity. So I think to one of my dear friends, Norman Fleury, who is a Métis elder language keeper, and we were talking about emotions and big emotions, and he says, sometimes we have to cry, because what we do when we cry is we empty our bucket, and then we have an opportunity to fill our bucket up with good thoughts and with good good ideas. And what sits right in the back of, you know, Sean's image there is that eagle staff that was carried through all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's event. I mean, that's a very, very important object in our country's overall journey to healing, which is what this is all about. And that led each and every national event. It led survivors and dignitaries into the rooms that we gathered in, and also contains a number of really important teachings. The first teaching of which is respect. You know, and it's just such a fundamental, you know, easy concept, wherein, you know, that's even how we started the work of Truth and Reconciliation. When we lit that fire at the Forks, it was the fire of respect. That is something that is so fundamentally lacking in the right's response to these histories and memories that are so inherent. And then as we walk through those other feathers that sit on that eagle staff, I mean, there's the feathers of courage, being courageous, you know, being honest with ourselves, being loving, being wise, being humble. And then that leads us to this overall process of truth. So if we need to look for our alternatives, I mean, some of these alternatives have been proposed and have been put forward and have been held closely by Indigenous communities for a long period of time, and have been used as ways to think about the positive work that needs to happen. That is really one of the only ways to counter the inherent negativity and the inherent violence and just the inherent ugliness of the colonial mind and the colonial effort.
Thanks, Ryan. Maybe to riff off that a little bit. You know, one of the things, this is, I'm a broken record, but this is something I'll be willing to be a broken record about. In volume 6 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, they kind of outline, have an answer for this, right? Like, I in the last few weeks, it's been like, what can we do? It's like the report tells us we should read it. So this is on page 161. They say, we believe that true reconciliation can take place only through a reshaping of a shared national collective memory of who we are and what has come before. The youth of this country are taking up this challenge. And I think we're seeing the diversity of tactics that they're doing that in the past couple of weeks. They say that reshaping national history is a public process, one that happens through discussion, sharing, and commemoration. As Canadians gather in public spaces to share their memories, beliefs, and ideas about the past with others, our collective understanding of the present and future is formed. Public memory is dynamic. It changes over time as new understandings, dialogues, artistic expressions, and commemorations emerge. Although public memory, this is sort of building on this, although public memory can simply reinforce the colonial story of how Canada began with European settlement and became a nation, which is where we're kind of stuck in our education process, right? The process of remembering the past together also invites people to question this limited version of history. And, you know, for me, where I see a lot of positive inroads is curriculum reform and changing the way that youth learn about Canada, not from a sort of a nationalistic perspective, but rather that uses history education to kind of prepare people to understand the past and be better prepared to deal with its ongoing legacies in the present. And so I think that education piece is the positive aspect. That education can be an arena in which a lot of this can be reshaped, so that, you know, future generations grow up with perhaps a different understanding of national memory that is not tethered to toxic nostalgia, but is actually building out from that respect piece and truth piece.
Thanks, Sean. For a brief flicker of time, I saw the raise hand hovering over Omiyasu there. Did you want to jump in, Omiyasu, before we?
Yes, please. Okay, so I remember, so Keith Carlson was my doctoral supervisor, and I was speaking to him about sort of a historiography of Indigenous values, and he was just challenging the idea that values were continuous, I guess, that they didn't change through time, even if they have the same name. And one of those that I brought up to him was respect. And so it was really interesting to hear you, Ryan, Sean, talk about that, because I do think that respect means different things to different people. And so some of you might be familiar with Paul Chartrand, had taught a class to me in undergraduate and talked about how respect, because respect means something different to somebody, we have to take the person's definition of their own self. So he said, some people like to be hit. So if they were showing you respect, they might hit you because they think that's what it's like to be respected. But we really have to ask the people what they like. And then more recently, I had my own definition, being that for me, respect was, you know, live and let live. I do me, you do you. And if we're not harming anyone, it's, you know, it's good to hear each other's stories and perspectives, but they don't have to be mine. So anyway, I was just wanted to talk about respect for a second. That's all. Yeah. And also, is everybody else selfish, lazy, and self-centered? This is my big question, actually.
I think that's just it. And I think, you know, in some of the things that I've even seen on the journey, at least, again, if I think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's efforts here, and they're symbols. I mean, they're not perfect answers by any means, but you know, even when I look to the logo of the TRC and it puts everything into those fires in a circle, to me, what that says is that it's the interrelationship, it's the holistic manner in which we ask some of these questions, and the external and the internal, you know, reciprocity between respect for oneself, respect for others, so on and so forth, that helps us get into what I hope are deeper conversations. And it's just, you know, I think society is so used to operating without that being present within conversations so often, that it is good to remind ourselves of at least what types of thoughts emerge when we begin to look at things through different lenses, or get into some of these conversations through different entry points. Because I think one of the things that's impairing us as a country is that we start the story so often where the right starts the story is like, you know, 1867 or Canada's 150th birthday. And we're starting the story with, you know, without a whole bunch of more context.
Thank you to everyone. I feel like we're kind of back on track in terms of the time here. And so there are a couple questions in the Q&A, and I just prompt folks out there in webinar land that you can kind of throw more things into the Q&A there. I'll keep on reading and moderating. But for now, I will take the first one. I'm just going to read the question. And I think it's just kind of a free-for-all. Panelists, just start speaking if you want. If it becomes cacophonous, maybe we have to resort to the raise hand feature, but let's just kind of play it by ear. So the first one's from Neil Montgomery, and Neil's curious about the role or lack thereof of right-wing intellectuals in this conversation. Beyond pundits and online comment leavers, emailers, is there an intelligent right-wing defense of the kind of orthodox defense or John A position in Canadian memory politics? Why does such an intellectual right, quote unquote, seem to be missing in the Canadian debate, perhaps in contrast to the historians' debate in Germany?
Adele, you want to take that one?
No, I think you can start. I'll jump in if I need to.
Okay, so I'm just reading the question. You know, is there an intelligent right-wing defense of memory politics? There is a right-wing defense of memory politics. Whether it's intelligent or not, I'll leave others to decide. I mean, I think there are a number of prominent figures, right? That some with academic credentials, some not, right? That are using a variety of different platforms, be it the National Post, be it the Dorchester Review, to kind of use those platforms to kind of push a kind of right-wing defense of memory politics, but also of the colonial status quo. I recently did a deep analysis of all of the online comments that Senator Lindbergh posted on her website, right? And one of the things that I haven't talked a lot about is the like common names that people would drop. Francis Widdowson. A lot of people, you know, just casually referenced Francis Widdowson, like a fairly fringe, very lazy defense of the colonial status quo in their comments, right? People like Comrade Black, people gravitate towards some of those kinds of arguments. And I would just, I guess, lastly, just point to Adele's reference of that Macdonald Laurier Institute letter, which had a number of different prominent academics, some very obviously on the right, some kind of in the middle-ish, that I think are, if you if you look at, you know, the common names, the growing threads, there is actually a right-wing defense of memory politics being led in part by people like Patrice Dutil, the Macdonald Laurie Institute. A lot of the people that write these kind of strange denialist articles sign their names to that letter. So I think there is absolutely a cabal. Whether they're intelligent, I'll not say.
At this point, it seems opposite to jump in here, because there's another one in the Q&A that I think can kind of keep us going on this particular line of discussion in a way that's fruitful. So I'm just going to take the liberty of reading this one out. And it comes from Paul Allen, who says, our protest of Macdonald's statue on Picton's Main Street in Ontario, my original Canadian hometown, by the way, since November 2019, was countered mainly, the anti-Macdonald protest was countered mainly by older, well-educated white men who promoted themselves as quote unquote lifelong progressives, quote, end quote, and quote, best friends of Canada's Indigenous peoples, sick. In other words, men who accepted them as representative of the left, not the right wing in today's politics. But their sloganeering, their marginalizing of those who challenge the status quo, questioning their patriotism, etc., served to give the political class cover and to gin up public fear about cancel culture. So how to deal with the liberal or neoliberal apologist in that kind of capacious big tent that Adele was talking about earlier. So yeah, what about self-styled progressives and their kind of anti-cancel culture position in these current debates? What to make of that? Let me ask you, want to kick us off here?
So again, I have to credit my BIPOC community for educating me in this area and how I finally came to understand white supremacy. As Adele mentioned, you know, the lack of humanity and or just taking away other beings' opportunity to have spirit is the way I would interpret that. But sadly, the reason I learned about white supremacy is obviously through being an academic and working in a university institution, which, you know, has its neocolonial methods. And why I learned that is because of myself and my Indigenous colleagues not having a voice. And so these individuals are exactly engaging in white supremacy because they are denying other people's voice. And that's, I don't know, you know, I think that's a tenet in anti-racism education. And I think when people do offer people the platform, like Adele and Sean and yourself, Matt, have done for me many times, to share their voice and perspective that comes from, I don't know what you want to call it, you know, beyond or outside, that is like excellent anti-racist education and excellent anti-racist practice. And these persons are not participating in that. So it's very clearly, it doesn't feel like white supremacy because we think of white supremacy as like such a strong word and has strong reaction, but it takes place on a daily basis. It takes place within our families. It's another of my personal realizations that I'm coming to understand, because as we all know that I'm half white. So I'm beginning to understand that aspect of the way I was raised also. So it sounds harmful, but by understanding that, it helps us to understand what is the opposite then, giving people voice and giving people power. And that's what these individuals are taking away.
So thank you for that, Omiyasu. One of the things that I'm sort of struck with, and I don't know if it's kind of a particular moment thing, and because I'm kind of old, I am mindful of how things seem pretty different about 10 to 15 years ago. So I was part of a project that Sean and I were recently in touch about, which was called the People's Citizenship Guide, which was kind of an effort to kind of speak back to a kind of Harper version of Canadian history. And of course, those years were associated with one of the upticks in commemorative naming practices around Macdonald. The other one happened around Expo in 1967 and the centennial. And then there was another uptick around Harper. And I think at that point, the fault lines to me connected this kind of particular kind of right and this particular return to a certain vision of Canadian history, which is one of my colleagues who's a Latin Americanist described the then Citizenship Guide as a nasty little book about the Queen and wars. You know, that sort of vision of history, and literally like radical Indigenous erasure, like the most incredibly passing and brief kind of mentions of Indigenous people in any particular way. But for where I sit right now, I think I would tend to see the kind of what we might see as a sort of more kind of liberal response to these discussions as the louder voice in the room right now in Canada. And that it's often people who the question from Paul Allen, you know, referred to here, who style themselves, though I think their actions clearly often complicate in very real ways that sort of styling, and Omiyasu has kind of brought that out in really clear ways. But I think right now it is those sorts of perspectives that seem to me to be the ones that that require the most kind of intellectual attention and engagement. And I think they end up carrying water for a different agenda. I don't know if it's their intention. I don't know if intentions matter. But I think what ends up happening is they do create talking points that then kind of get picked up when very real things happen, like Alberta school curriculum and its history curriculum gets revised. And then those sorts of apparently kind of soft liberal kind of friend of the Indian sort of perspectives really start to do a very clear kind of work for a different sort of agenda. But I do think we just kind of need to keep a number of moving parts in mind when we kind of map how this is all working out.
And just very briefly, just adding to that too, I think, I mean, this is the oldest game in the book too. I mean, this is there have been lots of solutions provided to, you know, what has long been framed as the Indian problem in the country without any engagement at all with Indigenous peoples. And that's kind of the heart of the issue. That's the displacement that's been going on. And of course, I mean, we need look no further than how residential schools were presented for so long in this country. I mean, that was supposed to be to the benefit of Indigenous peoples. Of course, not talking to families, not talking to children, anything like that, grounding that in terribly racist and diminutive ideas about Indigenous rights. So the displacement and the monopolization of the country and telling people what's best for them without any engagement is just, that is as Canadian as, you know, well, Tim Hortons.
Well, and also just to riff on that just briefly, is that if we take David Frum just as an example, right? The way in which he kind of performs, right, makes him seem like more of a progressive. CBC in the most recent US news election had him on as this sort of reasoned mind, right? I mean, this is a guy that was like, you know, defending George Bush and writing his speeches and continuing to defend him, right? And yet, you know, the way in which he is able to present himself seems like he's more of a progressive. And to Paul's questions, you know, remember that Senator Lindbergh, right, basically said, you know, some of my best friends are Indigenous and they loved residential schools, kind of using, kind of drawing on these kinds of ideas of assimilation as being progressive. And we do need to remember this is probably going to take us in a different direction, but when we think of like left, right, and middle, you know, we do have a very kind of skewed sense. You know, like almost all forms of colonial governance is, you know, a kind of fascism. Right? It just depends on how you're understanding that and who is in charge. I think lastly, Omiyasu, your point was like the answer is to give voice and power. Well, that's exactly what these pundits don't want, right? They're trying to stop that from happening. And using all of the things we've talked about to achieve that.
Can we just pop in there, Sean, that one of the signatories would have loved for me not to get a PhD, because why would you ever want a young Indigenous woman to have one of those?
There certainly is a rearguard defense aspect to a lot of this work.
So we got just two more in the Q&A, and I think I'll bundle them together and let people do with them what they want. And just very quickly, if I might, on the specific point of the kind of liberal or neoliberal opponents of so-called cancel culture and their supposedly more nuanced arguments for keeping Sir John A. Macdonald and others in the public square, providing cover for more explicitly right-wing or white supremacist perspectives. One of the things that strikes me as interesting in all this is the kind of Canadian exceptionalism and absolute lack of self-awareness here. That the idea that you know, if removing a statue, you're erasing history, and we need to have these difficult conversations. It's about a plurality of voices. It's like nobody in Germany who's at all sensible talks that way. Nobody talked that way in Eastern Europe in 1990. Nobody sensible talks that way in Richmond, Virginia today. And yet, here in Canada, anyway, I had to throw that in there. So just a remaining point from Ed Pullman about Victoria City Council cancelling its Canada Day celebrations. And Ed points out that what was not widely reported is the reason why was that Indigenous participation in the event was withdrawn due to mourning over the mass grave found at Kamloops Residential School. And he asks, you know, any comment on the situation or seeming need to villainize these efforts. So that's one thing there. Oh, goodness me, there's more coming in. I'll just try to throw them out there real quickly and we'll just see what people make of them. You can kind of just take what you want here. My colleague Will Graves says, wonders about the panelists discussing points of compatibility and tension between Indigenous resurgence decolonization frames on the one hand and left-wing Canadian politics on the other, noting the classic leftist response, sometimes suggesting quote unquote Indigenous or identity politics detracts from the development of working class consciousness and public ownership and redistribution of wealth and so forth. So what ways forward for leftist and decolonial politics? John Carlaw also throws in there wondering about the relationship between the far and the mainstream political party right in Canada when it comes to these history wars. John Swanson wants to hear more on unthreatening populism from the right, as the left-right labels, as Omiyasu pointed out, are becoming disconnected. And John Carla thanks everybody for the important work they have and continue to do in the area. So there's lots of things to dig into there. I throw it open.
Maybe just very briefly, speaking to the question about Victoria and Canada Day and that all I'll say about that is I would really I think it's really important that we recognize collectively just how painful at an event this discovery of children at Kamloops has been for communities and nations and individuals and families across the country. So it has been devastating in some ways, despite the knowingness of it. And I mean, maybe that says something about the contestation of memory, that somehow when certain memories really become so present or so, well, just so I don't even know what the word is, so present, let's just call it that, that it just unleashes these waves of trauma again, unleashes these waves of collective trauma. And that collective trauma is being experienced on top of all of the other trauma that is still being experienced on a daily basis through responding to emails, through participating in, colonized institutions, through speaking to media, to simply even opening up the news story. I mean, I'm having difficulty right now even reading the news. I like reading the news, but there's so much stuff on residential schools right now, and my emotions have been flying so high since the last little bit that it's almost hard for me to even engage with the memory practice of paying attention that I normally do. So I think let's just really make sure as a country right now we have the most profound empathy for what communities are going through and not underestimate how tough of a blow this has been, and the blow is both the discovery and then also the knowingness of how much more is still to come, so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I'll just, I want to thank Rye for, I think, putting that in such clear terms. And I guess one of the things that I sometimes think about, and in particular coming, from my own kind of particular context as a settler and a feminist and all of the messy kind of things that come from that, is I think that any kind of adequate place that we get to has to kind of begin in a recognition of the violence and the loss that has shaped us all. And it has shaped us all in deeply different ways. And it has allowed some of us to, you know, live lives of sort of joy and relative sort of security and opportunity. And it has diminished the lives of our neighbors. But in all of that, there is, I think, a huge amount of pain. And I think, you know, anything has to begin in recognition of how messed up we all are with what it means to be born in this country and live in this country. And I kind of feel like the longer I kind of sit with that, the more I'm able to kind of move a little bit easier, how sick we all are. But it, you know, anything has to begin with that, because nobody, you know, there is no possible version of Canadianness, certainly for settlers and for white folks, but there is nothing that is produced outside of this and not through this violence and this loss. And it is a mess that is ours, and we have to both recognize and work to find our way out of, but we will only do that by kind of beginning with the recognition of where we are and the trauma and loss that it has meant for Indigenous communities, that is constantly reanimated in so many ways. So this doesn't really get to the question of Victoria. I don't know, sitting here, I don't really see the villainization of that decision, though I think those are often things that are registered a little bit more closely on the ground. So that's something that Matt and Rye and the other people in Victoria may have kind of a greater sense of. That struck me as a responsible and meaningful decision that the city government took, and I would see it as an appropriate one.
I just want to buttress or support Rye's comments because for the past 3 years, I've had my students present on various reports from the commission. And so many of the students have read and reported on that particular report. So when the news came out, I just wanted to pretend it didn't exist. I didn't want to be reminded, and I couldn't be reminded. And I have actually stopped mostly reading the paper. Like, I'll read it just a wee little bit because the world is such a depressing place. I can't cope with that and run my life at the same time. So kudos to Sean for doing that. And Adele for keeping up on tops of current events, because I can't possibly cope. It's just not possible. And I agree, Adele, like that. Hopefully they made like a very emotional demonstration that they were doing this in solidarity with the people that they love and the people that they're grateful for, because that would be extremely meaningful for the community. But again, I will also agree that people in Victoria probably have more to say about that.
And maybe to decouple this from Victoria specifically, because Victoria is not the only place to cancel or to change Canada celebrations. I mean, I do read a lot of news and I try to be on top of it as a responsibility, but sometimes it still hits you in the gut. I mean, the decision by, I think it was St. Albert, which is just north of Edmonton, you know, that they were like, well, usually we like light off fireworks on top of like a burial ground of kids, you know, who went to residential school. I mean, like, whoa, like sometimes I just see these stories and it takes me right back to what Rye was saying, is that like this violent maintenance of these harmful mythologies. And it's not just in statues, right? There are a variety of public memory practices, including celebratory days, that are all complicit in that kind of maintenance that we're taking out and reevaluating and reckoning with in, I hope, pretty profound ways. And I think that local communities need to make decisions based on their own priorities. I don't think there's a blanket response, but I just to double down on what Rye was saying, I think you know, there's a lot going on right now, and you know, this idea of having a big birthday bash with birthday cake and fireworks seems out of step with where a lot of people are at.
mean, I'll just throw quickly, because I'm in Victoria, on the kind of specific Victoria angle, that one thing that struck me both in the Macdonald statue debate and in the decision to not do the Canada Day celebration is that in both cases they came from a mayor and a council who, you know, for whatever one thinks of their performance ultimately, certainly try to be responsive to Indigenous viewpoints and take seriously the idea of being in some kind of dialogical relationship with local Indigenous communities. And again, I just repeat it, in all the criticism of Victoria Council and their decisions that I've heard, I don't hear any of the critics explaining why Council ought not to listen to Indigenous communities and not be in a process of dialogue and response with them. And it's just, it's absolutely stunning that so much of this debate proceeds in this way, as if there's not even a question to answer, there's not even a negotiation to have, let alone some kind of project of land sharing and diplomacy and whatnot. But well, they're my own take. We're at 11:59, and so I think that concludes our event here. And I just want to give the most heartfelt thanks to the panelists and to the participants in the audience and the organizers and everybody at the Center for Global Studies. And I hope we have more conversations in the future. Thanks to everybody.